In this video, I'm going to create the code, transitions, and variables to allow the NPC to shoot at the player and to allow the player to lose health and potentially die. I'll be making changes to the NPC state macro, as well as modifying the enemy health code to work for the player object. If you missed the creation of the enemy health code, check out the link in the top right. Otherwise, let's get started. So before we get to creating the code, I need to make a small addition to the NPC. I want to add an empty game object to the end of the rifle to give the bullet a place to spawn. Selecting the NPC object and then opening the animation rig, I can find the rifle bayonet object. I'll right-click and add an empty game object as a child and rename it Projectile Spawn. I'll then move this child so that it is at the end of the rifle, and I'm also going to make sure that the blue or Z-axis of the empty game object, which is the forward axis, is pointing in the correct forward direction. Next, I'll create an object variable to hold a reference to this empty game object, and I'll call it Projectile Spawn. Now I want to assign the empty game object to this variable, but to do so, I first need to press the instance button at the top of the variables window to make changes to this instance of the prefab. I can then assign the type of transform and drag in the game object. Bolt is smart enough to grab the transform component from the game object. With this done, I want to press the prefab apply button at the top of the inspector to save the changes to the prefab. Next, I need to create a new scene variable that is going to control the distance away from the player that the NPC will begin to attack. I'm going to call this variable attack distance. It'll be of type float, and I'm going to set its value to 25. The value you may choose will depend on your camera and the style of play you want for your game. I need to make a couple other changes. The NPC has a large sphere collider around it that is used to detect when the player is nearby. This presents a problem as the bullets can hit this collider and will register as a hit. You may have noticed this when shooting at an NPC, and up until now, it was just a minor bug. But with the NPC shooting, it's now a game-breaking bug, as the NPC will shoot and kill itself. So I need to fix that. First thing I'm going to do is change the layer of the player detection object to ignore raycast. This is a built-in layer that will also avoid mouse clicks and other such things, so it's a good layer for this object to be on. Next, I'm going to add a rigid body to the player detection object. I'm going to turn off gravity and turn on is kinematic. The reason to do this is that on trigger enter and similar events will send a message down the hierarchy until they find a rigid body. So by placing a rigid body on the player detection object, I stop the message and prevent the on trigger enter event from being called on the base NPC object. Now let's look at the projectile object. The projectile will destroy itself if it hits any game object. However, I only want it to destroy itself if it hits an object that is not on the ignore raycast layer. So to do this, I'm going to select the projectile object and make a couple changes to the flow macro. I'm going to break the flow from the on trigger enter event and then drag down the collider node and search for game object layer get. This unit will return an integer value of the layer of the game object that the projectile has collided with. These values correspond to the integers that you can see in the layer drop-down menu in the inspector. Bolt has a built-in layer mask that can be used to compare layers, but I found that this does not return the correct integer values. So maybe I'm making a mistake, I don't know, but I'm going to work around it. So instead, I'm going to use an integer literal unit and set the value to 2, as that is the ignore raycast layer. I can then compare these two values. If they are not equal, meaning the object is not on the ignore raycast layer, then I want the projectile to destroy itself. Next, I want to build the transition from the chase state to the attack state. This transition is going to be based on the distance between the player and the NPC. So in the state macro, I'm going to click on the chase state and select add transition from the pop-up menu. And I'm then going to click on the attack state to complete the transition. Double-clicking on the icon in the middle of the transition opens the transition flow graph. I'm going to drag the scene variable of the player onto the flow graph to get a reference to the player object. Then dragging the output of the variable, I'm going to search for transform position and select the get option. Dragging the output from this unit, I'll search for and add a distance unit, which will calculate the distance between any 2 points. In this case, the position of the player and the position of the NPC. Then with the fuzzy finder, I'm going to again search for transform position and choose the get option. But this time, the default self option is what I want. I'll connect the output of this unit to the second input on the distance unit. I'll then take the output of the distance unit and compare it to the attack distance variable using a less or equal unit. I'll also drag in the attack distance variable and connect its output. The output of the less or equal unit will get connected to a branch, and if the branch evaluates as true, then I want to trigger the transition, so I'll connect the flow from the true node. The final piece of the transition code is to add an entry event. In this case, I want the conditions to be checked every frame. So I'll add an update event and connect the flow to the branch. I'm going to create the transition from the attack state back to the chase state as well. And since the code is nearly identical to this transition, I'm going to select and copy all of the code from the current transition. Then using the breadcrumb navigation, I'm going to go back to the state macro, and I'll add the transition from the attack state to the chase state. Once again, double clicking on the icon will open the flow graph for the transition. I'm going to delete the trigger transition unit and paste in all the code from the other transition. Now the only change that needs to occur is to replace the less or equal unit with a greater or equal unit. So right-clicking on the unit will bring up a pop-up menu with a replace option. Choosing this and searching for greater or equal is all I need to do. Alternatively, you could also swap the inputs of the less or equal unit to get the same effect. With that all done, I'm ready to work on the coding of the attack state in the NPC state macro. Double-clicking on the attack state, I can see the 3 events for the state. And in this case, I'm going to be using all 3 of those events. When the NPC is shooting at the player, I'm going to want the NPC to be looking at the player. However, by default, the nav mesh agent is controlling the rotation of the object. So I'm going to need to toggle this off when entering the attack state and toggle it back on when leaving the attack state. So using the fuzzy finder, I'm going to search for nav agent update rotation and choose the set option. I'll duplicate the unit and connect one to the on enter state, making sure to leave the value as false, and the other to the on exit state, making sure that the value is set as true. Next, I want to set the update event to run as a coroutine. I'll be using a cooldown unit to control the rate of the NPC's firing, and the cooldown unit only works in a coroutine. I'll drag out the flow from the update event and search for transform look at. The first option is the one I want. The target will be the player object, but before assigning that, I want to set the up direction, as this provides an axis for the object to rotate around. In this case, I just need to set the Y value to 1 and leave the X and Z values as 0. I'll drag the player variable onto the flow macro and connect it to the target input of the transform look at unit. Next, right-clicking, I'll use the fuzzy finder to add a cooldown unit. I'll connect the flow and then drag the fire rate scene variable onto the flow graph and connect it to the duration of the cooldown node. The cooldown unit will act as a timer to prevent the NPC from firing every frame. Before I add code to create and shoot the bullet, I want to check if the player is dead. There's no need to shoot if the player is already dead. So to do so, I'll drag out the completed flow and add a branch. Then I'll drag in the player is dead variable onto the flow graph and connect its output to the branch. If the player is not dead, then I want a bullet to be instantiated. So dragging out the false flow from the branch, I'll use the fuzzy finder to search for a game object instantiate. Once again, the first option is the one I want. I need to tell the unit what object to instantiate. One option is to drag the projectile prefab onto the flow macro, but in this case, I'm going to use the fuzzy finder to search for a game object literal, and then clicking on the little circle, I'll search in my assets for the projectile prefab. With that done, I'll connect the output to the instantiate unit. The position and the rotation of the bullet are going to be set by the projectile spawn game object that I created earlier in the video. So I'll drag the variable onto the flow graph, then using the fuzzy finder, I'm going to add 2 units. The first is a transform position get, and the second is transform rotation get. I'll connect the projectile spawn output to the input of each of these new units. Then the output of the position and rotation units I'll connect to the instantiate unit in their corresponding nodes. This will create the bullet, but now I need to give the bullet a velocity that sends it in the direction of the player. Using the fuzzy finder, I'm going to search for a get component. Adding the unit, I'll drag the flow and the output from the instantiate unit to the get component unit, and I'll set the type as rigid body. Next, I'll search for rigid body velocity set and connect the flow and the output of the get component unit. The next step is to create a velocity vector. And I'm going to do this a little quickly, as we've done this in previous videos. What I'm going to do is use a little bit of vector subtraction to create a vector from the projectile spawn to the player object. I'll normalize the vector to make it a unit vector, and then multiply the vector by the projectile speed to get the final velocity. With that done, the NPC is now able to shoot at the player. However, there is no health script on the player, so the bullets have no effect on the player. So let's fix that. The player health code is going to be functionally identical to NPC health, with only a few minor changes to the variables. Specifically, I'm going to create a player health variable that is a scene variable. The reason to do this is so that player health can be more easily accessed for such things as a UI health indicator, or maybe showing a game over type screen. It's not strictly necessary, but it does make things easier. In the variables window, I'm going to create a new scene variable and call it player health. The type of variable will be an integer, and I'm going to set the starting value to 100. Next, in the macro folder, I'm going to select the enemy health macro, and before I duplicate it, I'm going to make one small change that was an oversight when I created it. Namely, at the beginning of the code, I checked if the audio source was playing. I did this so as not to clip the sound effects, and this works great if the sound effects aren't playing. But if a second bullet hits while the sound effect is playing, that second bullet will do no damage. So I'm going to connect the true flow node of the branch and bypass the plane of the audio source. So with that fixed, I'm now going to duplicate the enemy health flow macro and rename it player health. Next, I'll add a flow machine to the player object and drag in the player health flow macro. You may notice that some of the units on the player health flow macro are lit up as yellow, and that's giving us a warning that something's wrong. In this case, we're missing an audio source on this game object. So I'm going to add in an audio source component. I'm going to leave the clip empty and then turn off the play on awake option just like I did with the NPC. Opening the flow macro, I need to change the isDead variables to the scene variable player is dead. I also need to change the health variable to the scene variable player health. Also, if the player dies, I want the player object to play the death animation. The NPC had a death state in the state macro that triggered the animation, but the player doesn't have a state macro. So with the player, I need to trigger that animation here in the health code. To do so, I'll add an animation trigger unit at the end and make sure to type in the name of the trigger, which in my case is called isDead. With that done, if I push play and let the NPC shoot the player will make sound effects each time it is hit, and when the health gets to 0, the player will do the death sound effect and death animation. So there you go. It's taken several videos, but I've created the basics of a simple top-down shooter style game. If you'd like to see more about the style of a game or have a specific request for a tutorial, leave a comment below or come find me in my Discord server. As always, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you'll subscribe and join me for my next video.